Moedim L'Simcha, and welcome everyone. This is the auspicious day, fourth day of Sukkot, which is the site of the Rebbe, Rabbeinu, Rebbe Nachman of Breslov. And I'd like to dedicate this second half of our Ushpizin Shiur to the Rebbe, whose primary story, one of his primary stories that he told, and we'll get to that in a moment, was the story of the seven beggars. And according to Rabbi Kaplan, the seven beggars correlate both to the Ushpizin and to the Yemei Voracious. So we're going to explore that programmatically. But first, a little bit of background. As you are probably or may be aware, Rebbe Nachman passed away in about 1811. He was a young man, less than 40 years old. He was the great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov through his daughter Adel, who was the mother of Fega, and Fega's son was Rabbi Nachman, and his father's name was Simcha, or Denga. The young man was born in Mezhebush, which was the Baal Shem Tov's hometown. He was a direct heir to the estate of the Baal Shem Tov. He grew up in the Baal Shem Tov's house vicinity, and although they did not learn or meet each other directly, certainly all the Talmidim of the Baal Shem came, visited widely. His grandmother, Udal, was really the spiritual heir of the legacy of the Baal Shem Tov, more than the Baal Shem Tov's son, and everybody consulted with her and went for brachas to her and gave fitlach to her, asking her to pray on behalf once the Baal Shem Tov passed away. What is interesting and unique about Rabbeinu Nachman is his universal appeal. Unlike other Hasidic Rebbeim, the possible exception of the Baal Shem Tov, and perhaps others, the world has developed very strong opinions about Rabbi Nachman, one way or the other. Within the world of Hasidut, almost immediately when he passed, his primary student, Rabbi Nassan of Breslov, who came from a revered Litvish rabbinic dynasty. His father-in-law was a very saintly Rav, who was the chief rabbi of all the communities in Galicia, recognized halachic master, who was not involved in Chassidus, didn't promote Chassidut, and wanted his son-in-law, gifted son-in-law, Rav Nassan of Nemirov, as he became to be known, to either be a Rav in his vast network of communities that deferred to his saintly father-in-law's jurisdiction, halachically, or do enterprising business, which incredibly the Jews of Ukraine were so adept at, despite the odds stacked against them, working with non-Jews and in very hostile environments, harsh environments, both physically and in terms of anti-Semitism, and yet they prospered. And his family were cloth merchants, and even Rabbi Nachman was familiar with that business from his own experience. And this was a big industry at the time, what we would call in modern 20th century lingo the shmata business, but not making dresses, actually. It was fine fabrics. So there was two ways for Nassan Nemirov to make a living, but he chose to cling to his Rebbe and became his bard. What I mean by that is he recorded his teachings extensively. All of the Likutei Moharan lessons were written by hand by Rabbi Nachman and or Rabbi Nassan, and recorded and published by Rabbi Nassan, one in the lifetime of the Rebbe and the second volume posthumously. Then the Rebbe encouraged Rabbi Nassan to ground his very lofty Kabbalistic Torahs, which are very difficult for a layman to fully appreciate, and we'll get more into that, into a very Litvish touchstone, which is Shulchan Aruch, and not Shulchan Aruch Haraf, by the way, of his contemporary the Alter Rebbe, but the actual Shulchan Aruch, the backbone of halachic observance. It's interesting that Rabbi Nachman wanted, through his student Rabbi Nassan, who was a world's expert in halacha, to take his inspiring, cryptic, and often undecipherable, but obviously brilliant Toros, and explain them in the context of that people could appreciate Hilchos Shabbos, Hilchos Yom Tov, the various halachas in Yoreh Deah, Kashrus, and by linking them to a halacha that was known, and also to a period of the year that was familiar, Moed, Hanukkah, Sukkot, Pesach, the words of Rabbi Nachman in that rubric became more accessible and more understandable. So the Likutei Halachos series is massive, and as far as I know, there's no extensive researched index for it, which is unfortunate, very deeply unfortunate. But it's a massive, massive work, and it's still really, people have only really scratched the surface in terms of digesting it. Rabbi Nachman famously said that if Rabbi Nassan had not come to him as a Talmud, not one word of his teachings would have been preserved. So you cannot underestimate Rabbi Nassan of Nemirov, his primary Talmud. There are many, many great personalities in Breslov who became teachers, the Shamina Rav, and Nachman. In our generation, the Rav Gedalia Koenig and his sons, the rabbis of Tzfat, who I was very dearly and personally close with, and who introduced me to Uman and to Breslov in a more profound way. I'm very grateful to them nearly 20 years ago. And the rabbis in Ukraine, the last surviving members in the Soviet era, who secretly, furtively made their way to Uman on Rosh Hashanah, as the Rebbe taught his students, please come to me for Rosh Hashanah, because Rosh Hashanah was a unique opportunity where his neshama could be mashpia on all those gathered with him, and for the benefit of Klal Yisrael. Rabbi Levi Tzuk-Bender and many others. We can't go through the history now of the leadership, but let's suffice it to say that without Rav Nassan of Nemirov and the various leaders that came afterwards, that ended up, for the most part, in the Ukraine, and some emigrated to Eretz Yisrael, either early on, like Rav Avram Sternhartz, certainly one of the great shining lights of modern day Breslov teaching, and a teacher of many of the great masters, including Rabbi Gedalia Koenig, who was a pioneer in Kiruv, a true pioneer in Kiruv, and encouraged his children to build the city of Tzfat as an Ir HaKodesh, as a natural prerequisite for the Shekhinah's return to Eretz Yisrael as a whole. So all these personalities contributed to the literature, but the literature itself breaks into two essential parts. The Likutei Maram, the teachings of the Rebbe himself, either that he wrote or that Rebbe Nassan recorded. Secondly, the immense Likutei Halachos series penned by Rebbe Nassan of Nemirov, which is, as we said, based on Shulchan Aruch, references to the year-round, bringing the ideas down to earth in a more digestible way. And then, of course, all the commentaries on either Likutei Maran or Likutei Halachos, the compilations, extensions of those ideas. And then there's the literature of Rabbi Nachman's stories. And perhaps, more than anything else in the world at large, Rabbi Nachman's stories have a tremendous sense of curiosity, not only to Jews, religious and not religious, but also to non-Jews, academics, Christians interested in Judaism, people who want to convert to Judaism, people who just are appreciating it as a form of Jewish literature. I had the privilege myself to get close to Professor Eli Wiesel, who was a big fan of Rabbi Nachman. And for those who don't know, besides his Holocaust books, he wrote extensively on various Hasidic figures, very eloquently and beautifully, gave lectures about the Talmudic masters, the masters in the Mishnah. I mean, his ability to converse in lofty and uplifting terms about key ideas in Yiddishkeit was unparalleled, truly unusual, remarkable man. Used to give lectures up in Boston University in his massive building there, he should rest in peace, that was built for him by one of his key supporters. And he would teach Rebbe Nachman stories from an old, worn-out volume in Yiddish, because originally the stories were Yiddish and then translated into Hebrew and then later into English by none other than Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan. Recently published by the Breslov Research Institute is a brand new compendium of Rabbi Nachman's tales, and Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, the fantastic and absolute genius, discovered in America and put to the holy task of bringing some of Torah literature's most esoteric Kabbalistic works into the focus of modern man in the English language. Everything that he writes was impeccably researched, extensively documented, and invaluable. Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan perished also young, like Rabbi Nachman. Some say because he revealed just a bit too much about the Kabbalistic texts, and the world was not ready or resisted his remarkable achievements. Passed away tragically in the 1980s. But he did translate and give voice to a number of the works. There's also the biographical tales of Rabbi Nachman's life, Chayam Maran, Shifrei Maran, which are attributed to his Talmud. But what I'd like to say is that, let's take a look at a historical perspective. As Rabbi Nachman passed away in 1811, the world was undergoing a massive transition, was about to undergo a massive transition to the concept of nationalism and democracy with the French Revolution, with the American Revolution, just nascent, just years before. And in Russia, Ukraine, the Tsar, sadly, was given rulership over millions of Jews, and Russia had never been a place that wanted to even admit Jews. Their strain of Christianity was so virulently anti-Semitic, ad hayom hazeh, that Jews were really not welcome in the Russian realm, which is why they restricted them to the Pale of Settlement, which was outside, including all of Ukraine, and impoverished them. And they led such a miserable life that some of the great Rebbes prayed that Napoleon, 1799 or so, be victorious over the Russians. Of course, he wasn't. So that the Jews would at least leave their crushing poverty and anti-Semitic decrees that they constantly faced, which again would later be even exaggerated. The religious persecution would be exaggerated up to the Soviets, which of course would lead to the fact that Rabbi Nachman's graveside became a criminal offense to even try to get there. It's kind of like what's happening now. But in any case, so the world was getting ready for a major shift. Many times in my Shiurim I pointed out, and I would like to include that in this year as well. When we speak about the 7 days of creation, that Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan says, together with Ushpizin, is the way to have a perspective on the story of the 7 beggars, the famous story of the 7 beggars of Rabbi Nachman, is also relevant not only to the days of creation, but to the millennium of creation that the Gemara, Sanhedrin 97a says, quoted in previous Shiurim, that the world will be following that pattern. We'll have 6 millenniums. Those are 1,000-year periods. And at the end of the 6th millennium, in other words, when we reach the year 6,000, which is really, really approaching very rapidly, we'll enter the period of Shabbat, the 7th day, and the world will advance. It is advancing, but will even further advance to such an extent that the physical realm as we know it will cease to exist, and will be some sort of hybrid spiritual physical world that we cannot fully determine what that means, but only rely on the words that we have from our greatest Rishonim, and back from the Gemara, etc., etc. But it's something that no one has ever really seen. I'd like to comment that this sixth day began in the year 1240. Its midpoint was 1740, and 1740 coincides with the birth of all these movements that the world had never seen before, whether it was democracy and emancipation of slavery, which became later in America, but first appeared in Europe, the rights of individuals, higher education, and of course, a lot of heresy, which the man's intellectual powers seem to go on a warp speed, and human reason and logic became the mainstay of the Western world. Something that I learned was that the Notre Dame, to pardon the expression, place of Christian worship, according to many of others are, which not that long ago burnt down. I don't know if it was ever really restored, or you don't hear it in the news because nobody goes there anymore, but it was the place where the Talmud was burned in that year, 1240, signaling a new era of the Messianic, both persecutions and redemptions. The Jewish people had gone through tremendous suffering, but as the world was going to change, new opportunities would come to them, not all of them so fortunate. For example, the emancipation of Jews and through Napoleon led to rampant assimilation. The persecutions in Russia kept Jews away from society, and that was one way that they stayed religious, but met the challenge of being conscripted to the Tsar's army and living miserable lives, not being able to build families, not being able to practice their religion. And Chavetz Chaim himself wrote a special volume for those Cantonistim. And there were many great Gedolim that almost were taken forcibly from their families to being conscripted to the Tsar's army, which include Chilul Shabbos, Tarfus, of course, rampant anti-Semitism, and more so. So it was a challenging era, Rabbi Nachman's day, but also opportunities were coming. Rabbi Nachman understood, perhaps better than almost anybody, that the world needed a type of Torah that would help the Jewish people go through this transition. He claimed, and this is one of the reasons Rebbe was persecuted by other Hasidus because of Rabbi Nachman's incredible statements, one of which was that his teachings were a chidush. They were something completely new, the world had never seen before, and they were the next level of the revelation of Torah after the Baal Shem Tov, and that there would be not any other level. In other words, no one would reveal more of Kabbalah and Sisrei Torah, the hidden dimension, we call the inner dimension, or Pnimius HaTorah. No one would reveal any more than what Rabbi Nachman had revealed until Mashiach. And he also claimed that Mashiach would also somehow relate to his own works and give Shiurim in his works. That was number one, what the other Hasidim presented about Rabbi Nachman. Second claim was, of course, Rabbi Nachman famously promised that anybody who would come to his kever and give a little bit of tzedakah and recite his 10 kapitlach that he selected, known as the Tikkun Klali, that Rabbi Nachman would engage on their behalf in the heavenly courts and see to free those souls from Gehenna and from suffering. In other words, that Rabbi Nachman would actually intervene on their behalf and use his supernal influence to gain entrance for his quote-unquote Hasidim to enter Olam Haba. And there are many stories about this, but I'm not going to go into that at this time. And how people had kind of near-death experiences, and they kind of were reviewing, they were experiencing their life review and judgment, and that Rabbi Nachman actually intervened for them, and they came back to earth for various reasons, but they remembered that intervention, and those stories have been widely shared. He said that he would pull up a Jew by his payas, but even if you don't have payas, I think that's the idea. He would do anything for him, or for her, for that matter. The Tikkun Klali himself, he revealed to two of his students, not Rabbi Nosson, but he said that they were a remedy against sexual impurity. That if they were cited as a unit, they were like a mini Tehillim, 10 out of 150, that had a powerful combination, kind of like a song. He describes them as songs, and the story of the seven beggars, he speaks about the arrows of the Satan, poison arrows of the Satan, that pierce the Jewish soul with sadness, depression, defilement, and that can only be pulled out or remedied through the songs that are represented by these 10 psalms. Of course, they are Tet Zion 16:32, Lamed Beis, interesting, Lev, like breast Lev. He said Lev Basar, it's a flesh and blood heart. And then 41:42, Memalef Beis, Nuntes Ayin Zion 59 and 77, and then Kuf He 105. No, excuse me, Tzaddik 90, and Kuf He 105, 90 and 105, 137, Kuf Lamed Zion, and Kuf Nun, the final kapitel. People who are close to Breslov, who feel themselves as a Talmud of Breslov, would say those 10 Tehillim every day. Not only that, but Reb Nachman, but would try to make the journey to Uman and Rosh Hashanah. So many did, and particularly in this year, and I've been blessed to go many, many times. And I always like to say, not everyone, how should I say, can get into being close to Rabbeinu and his teachings, but it is available for anyone. So let me reiterate that. Breslov might not be, quote unquote, for everyone, but it is for anybody. It's not for everyone, but it is for anybody. When I say anybody, it's without exception. Jew, non-Jew, Chassid, Litvak, seeker, not seeker, heretic, not heretic. Anyone who is interested, intrigued by his teachings, his stories, the experience of the effect of the practices that he focused on, especially personal prayer, Hidbodedut, davening in one's own words, ideally for about an hour a day, or a period of time, doesn't have to be an hour, where you talk to God as a friend, as a mentor, and look to create a personal relationship with Hashem that goes beyond ritual and rote. One could view Rabbi Nachman, especially from his story, The Master of Prayer, where he literally described himself as pulling individuals out of society, bringing them out to the wilderness, and mentoring each one according to what they needed. This one needed to be built up. He needed fancy clothes. This one needed to do modesty. He got less clothes. This one needed a lot of reinforcement. Each one to his own. The Master of Prayer, the Baal Tefillah, he saw himself, as he described himself, the Baal Tefillah, kind of like a personalized Mashiach. In fact, Rabbi Nosson did say, my Mashiach has arrived. So we could look at that as a way in which Reb Nosson was arguing, and the Rebbe was, and Rabbeinu was promising that the pathway to Mashiach began with individuals as opposed to the group. The more enlightened individuals that would gather together with this uniquely personal, heartfelt relationship with Hashem, grounded in practical halacha, which was the required learning, and some suggest also daf yomi. There was a group that was from Poland of Breslov Hasidim. There was a famous Rabbi Breiter, who was a kind of cornerstone of the teacher. He became influenced by the rabbis in Uman. He traveled to Uman, Ukraine. He learned from the masters that were there, brought his teachings back to Poland. We're talking about the time of the early 20th century, prior to the Nazis. And he perished in the Holocaust, Rabbi Breiter. But not before establishing the teachings of Rabbi Nachman in Poland. And when they no longer were able to travel to Uman due to the advent of the Soviet era, which barred it and threatened those who would go there, they made them their own minyan. And as the history tells us, that they convened in the famous yeshiva of Chachmei Lublin, which is itself a massively important subject. That yeshiva represented the modernization of the yeshiva to be on every level of the modern day academic society that tempted so many Jews, men and women, away from traditional Torah mitzvahs, which they viewed as being in the context of a quote unquote primitive or old fashioned culture. And Rabbi Shapiro wanted to lift Zatzal, the covet of Torah, and he did so paying with his own life, investing his own fortune, his life insurance policy, that there should be overcome budgetary concerns and build a massive building and feed Bachrim as if they were going to the finest, quote unquote, Havdalos secular institution, University of Berlin, you name it. So in that place, Rabbi Nachman's followers had their Rosh Hashanah Chabura. Some say that Rabbi Shapiro davened with them. And notice that according to Rabbi Nachman's style of learning, which was very, very much the alternative to what we came to be called today the classic Brisker Derech. Brisker Derech is the idea of finding through careful analysis and definitions, differentiations between various halachos, the stages of their development and their impact, and the ability, I would call, to split the atom, to see nuanced differences that clarify difficult seeming contradictions in the works such as the Rambam or beyond in the Talmudic literature and Rishonim. So that derech won the day. It was the intellectual champion of Torah learning. It saved Torah because young people wanted that academic level, lahavdil, and it kept them in the world of Torah. And it kept some of the brightest and most brilliant minds, not all of them, mind you, so many were lost and assimilated, whether it was to atheism, whether it was to nationalist movements, communism, socialism, even Zionism, secular Zionism. But the Brisker Derech allowed people who had brilliant minds to have a real joy in Limud Torah that satisfied their interest in investigation, classification, and knowledge. That was just so satisfying. Ad hayom hazeh. I mean, that is the cornerstone. Not that there was its own derech. Rabbi Nachman had a different approach, and I think it's the fact that Breslov, as it sounds, is more focused on lev basar, on developing a person's emotional and personal connection with God, than intellectual achievement of Torah, which the Jewish world cherished and still does. And not that the Jewish world doesn't. And today's such a hybrid after World War I and World War II. Every chassid has Litvisha tendencies, and every Litvak has Rebbeisha tendencies. They turn their Rosh Yeshivas into Rebbes, and in terms of davening at their kvarim, in terms of seeking guidance, personal guidance, very much a Hasidic model that the world has become integrated. Or not been said to learn a lot. Panovich used to do that too. Cover ground. Panovich, they wanted to learn a lot. So the Breslovers in Lublin used to learn a daily page of Gemara, because the Rebbe said, learn, just learn. Take a complete tour of Torah in your lifetime, all of Shas, Midrashim. Oh God, in fact, to his elite students, Rabbi Nachman challenged them to finish all of Torah literature every year. Even the most incredibly gifted students didn't quite manage to do all of Shas, Bavli, Yerushalmi, Midrashim, Agados, of course, Shulchan Aruch, and go without saying Tanakh, and so on, the vast corpus of Torah literature in a year, maybe a year and a half. But the rest of us were famous for being page turners. They would learn a lot. And in fact, in their years of being tormented, that was one way that they were identified in Israel and elsewhere. Says these were, he's learning a lot of blot at once. That's a Breslov thing. That's what Rabbeinu suggested. And some people suggest that the fact that they were headquartered in Yeshivas Chacham in Lublin inspired Rabbi Shapiro to institute a daf yomi, which was heretofore really unheard of because no one could understand how he could reach depths. Still can't understand how he could reach depths study moving in that pace. And it seemed to be a polar opposite to the general approach to learning. And I'm thinking that today there's more synthesis of both, and that one without the other is most certainly incomplete and is certainly part of what Rabbeinu recommended to learn Iyun. The persecutions of Breslov emanated from Rabbi Nachman's startling claims, as we said earlier, that he contributed to the development of Kabbalah and Pnius HaTorah, the final stage before Mashiach. Number two, that if you came to Uman on Rosh Hashanah or any time and recited his Tikkun Klali, that he would save your soul from Gehenna, which is why people, even under this year's circumstances and the recent year's circumstances, I mean, this past year, there haven't been any flights available directly to Kiev, as there were maybe 10 years ago, because of the war with Russia has rendered Kiev's airports destroyed. One had to fly into neighboring countries. Last year, they managed to secure many flights to neighboring countries, Moldova, Romania, even Poland, and Hungary. People found their way there in truly Yiddish resourceful ways. But this year, another blow happened when Moldova decided not to accept any Israeli charter flights for reasons that they said were financial, but in my mind, perhaps political as well. I think it was pressure brought to bear on them somehow to allow individuals, but not allow a large group of Israelis anyway. People were stranded. They had to make their way back to Romania. It was 24-hour bus rides back from Ukraine to places such as Bacău, Romania, tiny little airports, which had to dispatch thousands and thousands of travelers back to Israel. It was probably the most difficult year of traveling, and some people had easier times. They had trains, they had this, they had other opportunities, everybody their own mazel. But despite this fact, apparently tens of thousands of people went to Babin who can understand, who can appreciate the level of Mesiras Nefesh, the financial, physical, and emotional commitment that would make people take that journey. Which other Rebbe could possibly demand that sort of allegiance? And that's part of the mystery of it now. Why would Professor Wiesel teach it to a group of non-Jews? As I sat there, watched him do it at a huge table with his Yiddish copy of the Zion Betlers, of the Seven Beggars, discuss it with people as a piece of classic religious philosophical literature. How can we make sense of any of this? One thing I will tell you that left me that's a very big impression on me as I became more familiar with these sources, that there were in Ukraine, where he lived, especially in Uman, where he chose to be for his final resting place. He died of tuberculosis, like I said, before his 40th birthday, 38 something and change. And there apparently were very, very brilliant Jews who were maskilim and had become, I would call them atheists. People dedicated. They were very, very brilliant. They knew classics, Greek, Roman, everything, mathematics. Some of them came to see Rabbi Nachman. When he arrived in Uman, his last year of life, they wanted to make chayzik, they wanted to make a little fun of this Rebbe that came to their midst from the nearby town of Breslov. And when he arrived at their tish, at his tish, the Rebbe all of a sudden switched to a very esoteric Tosfos with a complicated mathematical calculation. And they all of a sudden kind of took it between the eyes and said, whoa, this guy is feisty. He's going to try to talk to us on our own level. And sure enough, they started to hang out with him. There was a fellow named Hirsch Bear. These people were, some of them later became professors at Oxford. We're talking about people of enormous intellectual gifts and also heretical views. And somehow they were drawn, they were so intrigued by this young rabbi who could take it to them in their own level. They once, they had a game with him. Rabbi Nachman said, I can quote you Homer and Plato. He just looked at it a little bit and he started quoting it, Baal Peh. Remember, Rabbi Nachman's knowledge of Torah was encyclopedic. He knew every pasuk in Tanakh, inside and out, Baal Peh. He knew Gemaras, he knew Zohar, he knew Yerushalmis. There was no limit to what he had mastered, incredibly, at his very, very relatively young age. But he could go toe-to-toe with these people. He played chess with them. And when horrified students like Rabbi Nosson would come to visit him and see him playing chess with these heretics, they would say, Rebbe, what are you doing here? The Holy Rebbe is sitting down with these apostates, with these people and playing chess with them, and they didn't call him Rabbi. They called him Nachman. They wouldn't even give him the respect of calling him a rabbi. They didn't believe in rabbi. They didn't believe in God. And then he said, Nachman says, it's not for you. It's not for you, but it is for Rebbe. And it's the last Rosh Hashanah of Rebbe's life. They took out a house to daven Rosh Hashanah with him. And this Hirsch Bear and his cohorts were there. And apparently he was also very, very politically powerful, locally, and also very rich. His attendant came with his shaving kit before Yontif to help him get ready for, to shave for the holiday, which of course is also according to Shulchan Aruch. And he refused it. And he went into Rosh Hashanah with stubble. And he said that had Rabbi Nachman lived one more year, he would have been a complete Balshu. As it was, he did an extraordinary thing. Rabbi Nachman suddenly and unfortunately passed away on Sukkot, today being the fourth day of Sukkot. There was a major, major debate what to do in terms of his burial. Uman wasn't his natural environment. He was more in Breslov. He used to travel to the more wealthy cities where his Hasidim were, Kremenchug and all these, more substantial cities in the Vinnytsia part of Ukraine. And each town came with its representatives wanting to claim burial rights. But this Hirsch Bear went over to Rabbi Nosson, who knew that although Rabbi Nosson wasn't respected as the leader, or certainly not as he was the Talmud Muvak, but not everybody appreciated him. There was people of great stature who were Rebbe's Talmidim, although he was no person of small stature himself, Rabbi Nosson. And he goes right to him and says, where does the Rebbe want to be buried? And Rabbi Nosson dutifully said, here in Uman. Why? Because there was a massacre of the Haidamach Cossacks about 50 years earlier, before Rabbi Nachman was born. And many, many Jews died in Uman of Kiddush Hashem. And that was a very big massacre. It was probably one of the biggest massacres in that area until Babi Yar, which would take place in the Holocaust also in Kiev. And you're not that far from Uman. Of course, all the Jews in Uman were slaughtered in the Holocaust, except those who could escape. So he says, okay, Rebbe, want to be buried here with the martyrs? Okay, good. He bought, with his own money, 2 spots, one for the Rebbe to be buried, one for there to be a canopy to put over, like a little building to put over those who would visit. And the Rebbe's third wife, his widow, paid for that little canopy to be built overwards, and that's why the Rebbe is buried in Uman today. All because of the effect of a local Jew, a brilliant apostate, who started to become a holy student of Rabbi Nachman and became his student, and himself paid for Rabbi Nachman's burial place, which became the magnet for all those Talmidim and for random people from all over, Jews mostly, who would want to make the pilgrimage to make connection to this unique, what we call tzaddik emes. Now, what's the difference in a tzaddik and a tzaddik emes? Rabbi Nachman took upon himself the burden of not just being a tzaddik, who's a great resource for people who can go and inspire them and teach them and take their fitlah. The tzaddik emes goes beyond his box, goes outside of the boundaries of his area, and maybe even his continent, and maybe even his era, and looks to draw vagrant Jewish souls back to their source. People who do kiruv work, and the Rebbes in the years before, such as the Frierdiker Rebbe of Chabad, who was rabbi in Russia in 1920 under the Soviet era, had to escape it to America in 1940, was Moser Nefesh and sent suicide shlichim to do bris milas and do cheder under the watchful eye of the Yeveskia, the Jewish atheist communists whose job was to destroy Torah Judaism from its roots, and who personally persecuted, beat, and imprisoned the Frierdiker Rebbe, and that story is a story for another time. But the people who said, Afal Pichein, I'm going to rescue every Jew. My Rebbe, Rav Yaacov from Torah Vodas Yeshiva, was a tzaddik emes, in my understanding. His heart was with the Soviet Jews arriving in Israel, and he and his Talmidim, I was part of that, established the Shuvu network of schools here in Israel, which has done kiruv work for 4 or 5 decades now, and is really a resource of tremendous power here in this country. Multi-million dollar budgets, all done with the serious nefesh to bring kids who know nothing about Torah and mitzvos closer to Hashem. So when you're talking about tzaddik emes, you're talking about somebody who has mass appeal. You have to think about, in our generation, the Bavitcher Rebbe, he had mass appeal. People came to him all over, Jews, non-Jews. You can go today to the cave of the Bavitcher Rebbe and see black ministers. They know. They come there with their lists of names that they're praying for. They know. The word is out. Here lies the tzaddik emes, an Avram Avinu kind of figure, which appeals to all people. We say, Nasi Elokim atop Kribbenu, it says in the Torah. You are the Prince of Hashem in our midst. And a great tzaddik always is that, beloved by all, Jew, non-Jew, brings out the spark of their holiness and their Tzelem Elokim to the max. Okay, with that introduction, we have another time. I'm going to have to do part 3. I wanted to get this out in terms of the yard site. I will tell you that I had a personal miracle the year I first went to Rabbi Nachman, way back about 20 years ago. In that year, I was privileged to daven in Uman for the first time, Rosh Hashanah, having the freedom to do so after spending many years in a formalized pulpit position. And when I became a free agent, it was the first year I was a beeline to the Rosh Hashanah, and in that year, I experienced a personal miracle of having a child born that was difficult to come by, and I had gone also to the Rebbe on the Melech's Keder. So, although my background, my father, who was very big tzaddik in his own right, Israel, came from a Litvish background near Israel. I kind of gravitated more to Torah Vodas. There were people like Rabbi and Moshe Wilson. So I had an appreciation of Hasidus, even though I worked in the non-Orthodox and English world, educated more in that world. And I see the advantage of a more nuanced and inclusive position And at that level, there are no arguments. My Rebbe would never speak bad about anyone, whether it was Lubavitch, it was Satmar, whether it was Rabbi Yosef Dov Levi Soloveitchik, the Rav. There wasn't such a thing. I mean, a tzaddik is a tzaddik is a tzaddik. And I believe that Tzaddikim Emes have that in common, that they're just above the fray. They just would never utter any word which would denigrate any other person who is an Oved Hashem. It's not possible. And this was the environment that I came to know. I encourage people on this day of the yard site to focus on two things. Number one, the Rebbe spoke about personal prayer to Hashem as a way of building a relationship. One could argue that the transition that took place in the 1740 and 1840 landmark years, as we make our way through this sixth day of creation, which is preparing us for the millennium of Shabbos, rapidly approaching, the intellectual knowledge of Torah, known as the Dal Amos Shel Halacha, allowed the Jews to survive, starting with Yavneh B'Chachameha, and all the way through the academies in Surah and Pedisa, and later in the North African communities, and Spain, and France, and Germany, and Poland, and all the places where Jews thrived throughout, and eventually back to America, and of course Israel. That journey of the Daled Amos Shel Halacha was primarily one of Torah knowledge, and it was a background starting in the 1740s, 1733, when the Baal Shem Tov revealed himself, to supplement that with a heartfelt relationship to Hashem as an emphasis. Not that it didn't exist before, but is your connection to Hashem through the Maisa of Limud Torah, or in addition with Tefillah, or personal? And of course, Rabbi Nachman said, of course it's both. He said, you daven and learn and daven. And he was very big about turning Torah into a tefillah, full integration, the mind and the heart. One could argue that Judaism was like kept in a box in our bitter golios years, wherever it might have been, and that the brain, the head of Klal Yisrael was preserved to the Daled Amos of Halacha, brilliant Torah scholars throughout the generations. But the actual manifestation of it struggled, because when we set down roots in one country, before you knew it, they were torn asunder, ripped up, and exiled. Especially in the countries that we suffered the persecution of the Christian church, and indeed of the Muslim mullahs. But we're now in Eretz Yisrael. And even to a certain extent in America, the full-bodied experience of Yiddishkeit is possible. Building institutions, setting down roots, I don't think so much in America. But the Kolach HaTorah is profound and has built communities of great magnitude in America. Hopefully they should continue to prosper and survive the travails of Galus. And here in Eretz Yisrael, we should survive the travails of that try to prevent the full manifestation of Yahadus, not just head, but body, heart, and soul. And of course, that is the pathway towards the Messianic era. We're undergoing a lot of change. I can't get into too much detail about the history, but there is a lot of history that we have to observe to understand the trends that have dominated the world and how the Jewish journey towards Geula are paralleled by that. And we'll have to take a break here. And having given you just an overview about the Rebbe, some of his intentions, some of his basic practices, and not even so much his Torahs, which is another subject. The Rebbe pioneered the battle of the 20th century against mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, lack of identity, poor self-esteem. His Torah, such as Azamra, where you look at the good point within every person, especially yourself. We're built out by psychological schools such as Rogeri and Regard, became part of psychology, social work, and now the entire positive psychology movement. Rabbi Nachman's teachings are and were groundbreaking foundational work on how to tackle the worst emotional states, addictions, depressions, conflicts, overcoming bad midos, shalom bias, parnasa issues. Solutions are there that only now in the 21st century are starting to become discovered and appreciated in a more profound way. But everything seems to be integrating very nicely. We need the lumdus, we need halacha, we need the ability to battle our inner battle against the Satan, which represents depression, anxiety, sadness, worthlessness, purposelessness, mindless pursuits, sexual frivolity and immorality, just the worst challenges that our generation has ever seen, and maybe any generation has ever seen. Rebbe Nachman was there to lay a foundation that preceded it, kicked in refuah lamaka, and only people now today are starting to realize it. So the story of the seven beggars is an epitome of that attempt to explain to people a perspective on life, which will be far more successful and out of the box than what you might have thought otherwise. It's linked to the message of the Ushpizin. It's linked to the message of the evolution of creation that Hashem wants the world to mature through in these 6 millenniums that we're in, and the very end, which we approach, and the events in the state of Israel that we're going through, especially today. So to be continued, we'll go a little deeper now that you have at least a superficial overview of what Rabbi Nachman's intentions and purposes was. From my perspective, there's so much more to say. People have differing views. People could say that whatever their opinion and experience would greatly differ from mine. This is what I can humbly offer you on this holy day of his Yortzeit, and that the integrative approach of Torah, psychology, positivity, resilience, positive regard, shalom bias, all these things are somehow magically rooted in the teachings of Rabbi Nachman in ways that are only being discovered. To be continued. Thank you. And we'll be back.
It's